all through my political career and over the last several years as Prime Minister, I've said repeatedly over a very long time that the Senate must be reformed, and if it cannot be reformed, it should be abolished. The fact of the matter is, as you know, Canadians remain divided over whether they want to reform or abolish the Senate. On reform versus abolition, the Supreme Court ruled, as you pointed out, that both reform and abolition would require unanimous approval of the provinces. So that's the situation we're in. What I take from this is the following. Canadians are not divided on their opposition to the status quo, that is, to an unelected, unaccountable Senate. The government is not going to take any actions going forward that would do anything to further entrench that unelected, unaccountable Senate. For the past 2.5 years, since the Supreme Court decision and prior, I have not made any appointments to the Senate. There are now 22 vacancies in the Senate. And let me be clear, it will be our policy to formalize that. We will have a moratorium on further Senate appointments. This has two advantages. The first and obvious advantage is that it saves costs. As we've been doing this, costs have been falling in the Senate. In fact, Senate expenses are now down some $6 million from what they were. It's still a long way to go, but they have come down, and they're going to come down more. But the second advantage of this approach is I think it will force the provinces over time, who, as you know, have been resistant to any reforms in most cases, to either come up with a plan of comprehensive reform or to conclude that the only way to deal with the status quo is abolition. So that is the path we're going to take, moratorium on future appointment of senators. Let me just maybe say one other thing about the government's position. As I said, we will not name senators as long as we can pass government legislation. And, you know, looking at the numbers in the Senate, that should not be a problem for several years.
Prime Minister, you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, formally entrenching your policy on the Senate. Yeah. If you do win another term, does that mean another 4+ years, no appointments? And by what method would you entrench it? Would it become law, for example? Well,
we'll entrench it simply in this way, which is we're just not going to make the appointments, and the number of vacancies will continue to rise. Let me be kind of blunt about this. The number of vacancies will continue to rise, and other than some voices in the Senate, and some people want to be appointed to the Senate, no one's going to complain. And I think that's going to put, our costs in the Senate are going to fall, and I think that's going to put increased pressure on the provinces. As Premier Wall has mentioned, all of whom but Alberta and Saskatchewan have fought the government's reforms. Let's remember what this government proposed in terms of reform. We propose that senators be elected, and they be elected for a term of limited duration. And every province but Alberta and Saskatchewan went to court to fight that. Now, if you're not going to make those reforms, I don't know what reforms you're going to make. But look, they've got a chance. The ball's in their court. They can now propose reforms. In the meantime, the membership in the Senate is going to continue to shrink, and Canadians are going to ask the question, if you don't have a program for reform and we're not missing the senators, why not just abolish it? And I think that's the pressure that's going to rise. I can't formalize non-appointment. That would be a constitutional change, but under the Constitution today, the Prime Minister has the authority to appoint or not appoint. That's an authority. The numbers are such, we have a good majority, the numbers are such that we don't need to name senators. I don't believe we will need to name senators. So we can leave it in that situation. As I say, with 22 vacancies now, and how many people are noticing? What are the problems this is creating? None. Look, I think it's time for people to act. If you have a program of reform, to elect the Senate and make it, as the Premier said, a 21st century institution. Legislatures are elected in the 21st century. If you have a program to do that, show it to us. If you don't, then take the other set of actions.
Thank you.
Atlantic provinces, excuse me.
If I could just add, we have. I think the point is well made. Eventually, Canadians are, I think, going to apply a bit more pressure to their respective provincial governments. I think that's happening already. I've even noticed it anecdotally. I myself was sort of one who advocated the Triple E reform, and many others who are moving off of that as they see no prospect of that ever being achieved, and rather they're left with the reality that what we'll have instead is a triple U reality for the foreseeable future: unelected, unaccountable, and under investigation. And I think Canadians are, I think they'll eventually be reaching out to their premiers, if they're not already, saying, you know, if this thing cannot be fixed,
Sorry, can I just
surely we should move on.
Can I just hear what your other question was about Atlantic Canada? Our which, sorry?
The Atlantic Canada is not budging.
Yeah, look, well, time will tell. I think, as I say, I think public pressure will rise. I know that some in Atlantic Canada, some premiers and others have argued, well, this gives us more weight in Parliament. This protects the number of seats we have in the House of Commons. Let's be clear about this. The number of senators you have today in the current institution gives no real weight in Parliament. Decisions are made for all practical purposes in the House of Commons. Secondly, the argument that some provinces make, you know, PEI, for instance, I've heard this, well, the number of senators protects the number of seats we have in the House of Commons. That's not actually true. The number of seats protected in the House of Commons is based on Senate representation in 1982. It doesn't matter whether the Senate exists in 2082. Those numbers are protected regardless of whether the Senate exists. So those are not, as I say, I think those who are advocating keeping the Senate, but they don't propose any way of reform, I think they're going to have an increasing problem making that argument. You can't be both against abolition and against reform. The one thing we know Canadians will not support, this government will never support, is simply keeping a status quo Senate. That's not acceptable.
Thank you. That concludes our Q&A.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Go ahead and move this one. Great.